Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, welcome to another Art of Procurement Tuesday interview. So my guest today is Dave Hulsen. Dave is a procurement entrepreneur and he co-founded an RFP collaboration platform called RFP 365 back, 4 years ago now, which is crazy, in 2012. Dave's vision is to really bring RFPs into the 21st century by taking them out of Word and Excel and bringing them online. So I do give a little bit more background on Dave once we jump into the interview. The reason that I was interested in this show today and talking RFPs is that the RFP process is something that I feel I've got a really particular interest in. And actually, I recently recorded a Friday show, which was back in episode 21, that explored if we as procurement professionals, are we abusing the RFP process? So today, I was excited to get to speak to an expert that Dave is and take that concept forward. So you'll hear Dave talk about the circumstances under which we should be using an RFP versus other tools that are out there like an RFI or, frankly, just picking up the phone. And then if an RFP is the right tool for the job, what do we need to do to make sure that the RFP brings value to the process, that it's just not, a burdensome document? Okay, well, before we get started, I do want to let you know that if you haven't done so already, you can sign up to be notified every time an episode of The Art of Procurement is published. So you just head on over to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, pop in your email address, and you'll be happy to hear you'll never miss another show. As a thank you for doing it, because I know how valuable it is that you give your email address to me, then I'd like to send you a couple of reports that we featured on the show previously. One of them is will help you in your procurement job search if you're looking for a new job. Kind of look at what the tips and tricks are to secure that dream procurement move. And the second report it's really a checklist, and it gives you a number of questions that helps you determine the health of an existing supplier relationship. So when you're in the middle of a supplier relationship, kind of midterm in the contract, you can use these to determine what the likelihood is that your engagement is going to succeed through the life of it, or whether you need to be thinking about changing scope, mitigating, or even terminating that engagement. So again, the address is artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Okay, well, without further ado, let's go straight into the interview. So, hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's show. As I mentioned just then before the music, my guest today is Dave Hulsen. And Dave's the co-founder of RFP 365, a software company that helps buyers and sellers issue and respond to RFPs. So Dave's had a really varied career to date. I was really interested when I was kind of doing a little bit of research. It included spells teaching, consulting, and in the Kansas Army National Guard. So all those before forming RFP 365. So Dave was also providing medical support and training in Saudi Arabia, Uganda, and Djibouti. So Dave, that's a pretty varied background, and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me today.
No problem. I'm actually delighted you were able to join me. Before we start talking procurement, I touched on it a little bit before about your military experience. And when I was doing some research, I came across an article that you wrote recently about 3 tips that you took from your military mentors into your business career. And when I looked at them, I found myself kind of nodding in my head in agreement when I was reading them. So I just thought it would be great if you could share them with the Art of Procurement listeners.
You bet. Well, I kind of stumbled into the military in a roundabout way. I was actually out in the consulting world for a while. And so I was a late bloomer in the military, but to be honest, I was just a little bored with my job and needed some excitement. Mm-hmm. So I came in to the Army as a 30-year-old person, and which gave me, I think, a really different perspective. But I had some really great mentors there. And that article that you found, I quoted a couple of things, and one of them was about creating trust. And that's important in a lot of fields, but in the vendor and supplier relationship, in the business community now, I feel like we're seeing trust more and more. I mean, the clients that we're working with don't just rely on their vendors and suppliers for a good or service. It is more about, it's a true partnership. The second quote I know you saw out there was about life is a balancing act, and this was about your work and your home have to be in healthy order. And this was my roommate over in Africa, who unfortunately his wife became pregnant right before we went away for 15 months, and so he had a real big balancing act the entire time, making a couple calls a day, standing in line for an hour to use the phone.
Yeah, when you talk about life being a balancing act, it's something that we lose sight of, I think. We think that what we're doing is the most important thing in the world, work related, and oftentimes what we're doing isn't brain surgery, and it can kind of wait till tomorrow, but we often lose sight of that, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about these mentor quotes, and I actually added one in my own notes here, because one of my best bosses ever sat me down during my annual review and gave me my bonus check and said, you can have this, but you have to go out and buy a motorcycle with it. And she was absolutely correct with that, and really helped me develop the personal side that of anybody's life. Right. You need to have that good balance.
Right. And you talked about the fact that you had a pretty varied background. So I was interested, how did you go from that into basically procurement and a procurement software business?
In my job as a consultant, right when the internet was in its infancy, we were doing a lot of projects to help pretty big brands find e-commerce solutions and marketing solutions. And I did a lot of vendor analyses, and there were a bunch of Excel spreadsheets that were going back and forth, and what I soon learned were requests for information, requests for proposal, though I probably didn't call them that at the time. And I look back and I feel so bad at how efficient or inefficient this process was that we required our vendors to go through, and these multiple tabs of Excel spreadsheets, and this process that was just wrought with red tape and bureaucracy, and so this really planted the seed, and this would have been in 2000 and the late 90s that I really started to think about this, and that continued on when I came back into consulting in the mid 2000s, and finally my partner and I said, man, we really got to solve this problem. And
it's from the outside, it's a pretty crowded marketplace. So, and oftentimes an RFP software is just part of what's, a broader end-to-end solution set. So I was interested to hear your perspective on kind of the motivation for building something that focused just on the niche of an RFP.
Yeah, we had been involved with some RFPs through, the SAP Ariba platform. And since then, we've come across many RFPs in the IBM platform and Bravo, and all of those are parts of these big suites of platforms, and they do provide a lot of there's that consolidated effort. So and especially in a big organization, right, they buy this enterprise software, but where we really struggled was that there were we were still pushing around documents, and the last one we did in an unnamed solution, I got this invitation. I opened it up. Here's this portal, and all it was a collection of like 15 Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
And so I thought, man, this is really disjointed. And as we talk more today, there's so much more when you're passing data back and forth. There's so many connections that are so important in a feedback loop that's possible that we don't have when we just have these static documents.
Right. So for context of today's show, a topic that I'm really passionate about is whether or not we as procurement professionals, if we abuse the RFP process. And, by that I mean, do we use it as it should be used? Do we consider the burden that we place on suppliers when we're issuing RFPs? And do we leverage technology that's out there to kind of make the process as streamlined and as effective as possible? And I think oftentimes the answer is no. I talked a little bit about that in a recent Friday show on the Art of Procurement, and I'm going to link up to that in the show notes today. But I actually invited Dave onto the show to talk about RFP horror stories and specifically what can we do to avoid pitfalls associated with RFPs, make sure that we're maximizing the effect of what is really a primary tool in our procurement toolbox. So Dave, as someone who sees a lot of RFPs, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see buyers make when they build and issue an RFP?
You bet. I have to say I was guilty of most all of these horror stories. And as a consultant, and now as we respond to many RFPs and RFIs and security questionnaires, I'm living that every day. And I know that that's just karma coming back. But one of the biggest things, you'd be surprised, I think, how many physical proposals are still being mailed around. My wife is in the marketing or in the architecture and engineering space, and they spend a ton of money just at the print shop. And we actually just were involved with one a couple months ago where we had to mail it in, and I thought, this is so difficult for me to justify, because now that this paper document goes back to this potential client, they can't do any sort of searching, they can't do any cutting and pasting of content. It is truly locked up, even worse than if we would have just submitted everything as a PDF or a locked Excel spreadsheet. So that's probably the biggest thing. And one of our municipality clients, once they adopted our platform, they put a sticker over, they had a box in their lobby, and this is where all proposals were dropped off. And they put a sticker over it, and they said, we're not accepting any more proposals here. It has to be done electronically. But I will say there was a step forward with these platforms we touched on a minute ago, wherein the documents were passed back and forth. But these portals, it was a good step for sure, to move away, to get these out of email, because even that is a challenge when you're always 3 versions behind your colleagues. But just even the portals that are out there, and passing Excel spreadsheets and Word documents, it's a little, there's a shortcoming coming there, and I'll talk about that in terms of kind of where the future is, where we see it going, and where we're obviously trying to steer it. But we're getting more electronic, we're getting a little bit more digital, but it still is. We still have all this great data that's locked up in documents, but it takes there's so much work that's then involved in extracting that data from those documents. I know I've spent countless hours in then trying to build complex Excel spreadsheets to do analysis of documents that are passed backwards and forwards. And as you say, you kind of lose revision control. You lose there's just so much time that goes into doing that could probably be best spent doing things more strategic. Yes, one of the universities in our area published an RFP, which they had typed up, presumably in Word, saved as maybe a PDF, printed it out, and then they scanned it back in and posted that to their portal. And so when I looked at this RFP, it was a little canted, and because it was an image, and I couldn't parse it, I couldn't get it into Word in any way. It was just basically a multiple page, a 50-page picture.
Right.
And that's what we had to go on.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit, I've read about the questions that folks actually ask in RFPs and some of the challenges that you have as you see RFPs coming in. I just wonder if you could kind of expand on that a little bit.
You bet. We spend a lot of time with our clients reviewing their RFPs as they're getting ready to be published. And some of the things that we look for are painting the vendors into a corner. And by all means, we love and we offer the ability for people to write, questions that should be answered with yes, no. And that's great when you're gaining information on a vendor's capabilities, but they can be very restrictive, and we have to be careful with the use. And painting somebody into a corner of just answering yes or no, and there's more information out there that we should be gathering. So it's just kind of the way we frame up those questions, and we especially love when people frame up in terms of how can you the vendor help us achieve our objectives. And so they're really starting from, it's very client focused. This is what we're looking for. This is what the stakeholders are asking for. And how can you help us be successful? And just knowing that as a vendor, and when we're responding, we know not only what the question is, but what the intent of that question is. And so we can say, hey, listen, this is a solution that will really help you with your time and cost savings and all this kind of thing. But just answering questions without that context is really difficult.
Yeah, and also you don't really know what the information is going to be used for, whether they're just shopping for ideas or whether it's truly the intent is to understand if there's a potential for a business relationship. And also whether it's something that you're going to be prescriptive in terms of what you want. And, sure, sometimes there's a time and a place for that when you're buying more commodity-based items. Mm-hmm. But when you're buying a lot of services, you really want it to be as open as possible because you want your supply base to have as much flexibility as they can in responding so that you're picking the right solution, not what you think is the right solution.
Yes, we have a client in the consulting space in retirement services who's very forward-thinking, and we actually developed this functionality together with them, and they are able to they have what we call profiles built for different categories of their vendors, and so in this case there are about 50 vendors that provide these 401k and pension services, and they were able to ask all these questions in different sections, but these are questions that the vendor community can go out and they can update their answers at any time. So while there are all these questions that are out there, their landscape is changing. They're able to update their information. Maybe their security model changes or functionality changes, their client base changes. And now when this consultant goes out with a new client need, they're able to essentially survey all of those capabilities, right, and then launch an RFP. And the last half dozen RFPs they've done have been fewer than 20 questions because they say, hey, we know they can shortlist from 50 down to 5, and they say, okay, we know exactly what you can do. Now tell us for this client, how much will it cost? How long will this take? And then provide a couple of references and things like that to call, but everybody loves a 20-question RFP.
Right. And that's an interesting one because that's actually something I talked about just when I referenced a previous show, is that I see that we're kind of lazy as procurement, and lazy is probably being harsh. So we're so busy in our day-to-day jobs that we just don't have the time to probably commit the time necessary to be a bit more strategic in how we think about an RFP and actually in terms of our data gathering in advance of it. So we just use an RFP as an excuse to gather as much intelligence as we possibly can, see what comes in, and then start thinking about, okay, who should we be using? Whereas probably the most optimal use is you do all that research up front so that when you are going to market, as you say, it's a very limited RFP. It's very straight and to the point, and you're not kind of fishing for intelligence. You're actually trying to find what the capabilities of a provider are.
Yeah, we co-hosted a webinar a week or two ago in the employee benefits space, and the partner we had in that talked a lot about make this a multi-step process and go out and gather a broad range of capabilities first. Make it pretty quick and easy, so that your vendors are spending, 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour putting together these responses, and then whittle that down. And then, it's good for the procurement folks who are out there. They need to look at the broad landscape and see who's doing what, get their information updated, but then be able to identify the real potentials that when we go into an RFP, we want, maybe 3, maybe 5 really serious vendors to spend time on the responses.
Right. And so from a supplier perspective, you're in a pretty unique position that you get to see both sides of the table, both buyers issuing RFPs, but also sellers responding to them. So, I'm interested in kind of what you hear from sellers and what their perspective is on when they receive these bad RFPs and how they react to them.
Yeah, we definitely have seen our fair share that we respond to, and then we've got hundreds of vendors just in the last couple of weeks who've come in on a number of big projects. I will say that all of them, well, I can't say all of them, those who have contacted us afterwards and said, in numerous cases, they have said this was the best RFP they've seen. This was almost fun for them in that they weren't printing out things. They had we made our software be very collaborative so that you can have 5 or 10 people working on it in parallel on the seller's side, so that they can get in, keep track of who's working on what, setting the seller or the respondent up for success is a huge focus. It's a big mission for us, and they really respond well to it, especially when they're able to message back and forth with the issuer of the RFP. They can have in-context conversations. So you don't spend a lot of time working on a response if you don't know all of the true questions. So they're able to have that conversation, work together. There are some task notifications and things to keep the process flowing. One of the things that our consultants really like is that we save all of the responses that the sellers write. So the first RFP, they're kind of starting from scratch and they're building that knowledge base. By the second and third RFPs they're doing in our system, they're able to drag and drop answers in. And so that really saves them time. And we actually, because this is not a document that you download, it's in the web, it's on the web, we actually track every click and we show them who on their team was in there working on this, how much time they spent, so we can really show them what their investment is in this opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. I've had the opportunity, for better or worse, I've been on both sides of the table in terms of writing RFPs, and I've been guilty of a lot of the things that we talked about, as you said that you have, because that's kind of just what you do, and it's also the easiest thing to do, and you're strapped for time, so you want to make it as easy as possible on yourself. On the flip side, then that creates such a burden from a supplier, and so as a supplier, I've been responding to RFPs, and you look at some of them that come through, and you just think, I just don't have the ability to provide all of this information, or this is going to take so long. I'm not going to put my best resources on completing this because it's going to take hours and hours of time, and there's too much risk. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. So, I'm interested to understand kind of how you see, when you think of companies that successfully make the RFP a two-way process rather than a one-way process, what are they doing?
Yeah, we just kicked off the second phase of a big project today, and one of the things that they did was start off with, I think the first round of questions were actually about 6 questions. There were 6 very important questions, and what I loved about their approach there was that last year we had a huge 700 question RFP for a big North American distribution contract, and there were all these questions, and I found out later that 5 of those questions buried in there were critical make or break questions.
Right.
And if those could have been out there in front and just let the vendors exclude themselves if they can't deliver on the most important things, and that would have saved so much time. When you think about not just the vendor's time, which is an important consideration, but the issuer that has to prepare all this and then grade the responses. So in this case, there were 700 questions and there were 10 respondents. That's a massive number of data points.
Right.
And if you're asking these questions, you need to be prepared to evaluate the responses, or else you're really doing it's an unfair ask at that point in time.
Yeah, and I find a lot of the questions are kind of just to keep in your back pocket. If you ever then somewhere down the line require some data points to either use in a negotiation, because you need to find some way of getting leverage over the seller, or just 3 years into the contract and there's some issue with a a risk factor or a business continuity or whatever it may be. So you can actually go back and kind of dig into the RFP rather than, as you say, it really being critical to the decision-making process for who you're going to source.
I was just looking through an RFP, going through the system today, and the same issuer had asked questions of roughly the same vendor community again, and there were some sections that I could find were repeating, and questions about the net promoter score and how they handle customer service, and these were very general. They didn't have to do with the specific client project, and so we try to train the issuers when they prepare these RFPs that these should be done, in this phase before or in the profile, so that all this is just generally gathered before the RFP itself. But even if those questions are asked every RFP, the great thing about having a search engine to help you answer the question is that at least you're down to one click, where the search engine says, hey, I've been asked this exact question before, and with one click, it answers the question.
Yeah, it's not somebody else different on your team who's having to think above the answer again every single time they answer it.
Yeah, well, when I was responding to an RFP many years ago, there was a question about how many offices we had and the staffing at each office, and we had grown a lot that year, and it took me over an hour to get an answer from our headquarters on a question that really should have taken me about 40 milliseconds to answer.
So what I want to do is I want to kind of go into a little bit more on some do's and some don'ts. But first, I think one of the most critical questions is, should you even be using an RFP in the first place? And, we often use RFP as kind of the go-to document without thinking, is it kind of fit for purpose in terms of what we want to get out of something. So I'm just interested to know what you see in terms of when we should use an RFP versus perhaps when you should use an RFI, or perhaps you just need to pick up the phone and have a quick call with a supplier.
Yeah. The RFP process obviously predates the internet. The amount of information that we have on our vendors in general is quite great now. There's a lot of background research. When I see questions like, who's the point of contact and where's your address, I think, really? Did you have to ask me that? Because you found me for the RFP, first of all. But some of these questions can be gathered in what one of our partners last week called a market assessment, where you just go out there. It's part of the planning phase. You go out there and you start to see, who are the vendors that could possibly help us with this need. But then I think going into letting the vendors know with an RFI, give them a call. Would you be interested in participating? We're gonna make this multi-part, but we're gonna send out some broader questions first. And I shouldn't say broader. We're going to send out some capability questions first. And if there are big swaths of functionality you need, this is a great time. For example, we don't do any sort of reverse auction functionality. We don't want to be involved with kind of commodities purchasing. And so we tell people that right up front. And there was a great RFP. I really wanted to participate on it, but it had a section on reverse auction. And I contacted the procurement officer and I said, do you really need reverse auction? And they said, well, we're not sure, but somebody told us to put it in there.
Right.
I said, well, we don't offer that. So are we going to be excluded? And they didn't know. And so before we went on with anything else, I actually pulled us out, and I hated to do it. Local company would have been a great relationship. But so understanding those needs, and so that's a big thing. Before the market analysis, even before an RFI, sitting down with the stakeholders and starting from a high level, writing on a whiteboard and saying, what do we want out of this relationship? We want certain functionality, we want certain cost savings, we want a revenue bump, something like that, and being able to frame up every step of the process. And in the consulting world, we call that being very client-focused, and even in the procurement world, thinking of your stakeholders as the clients in this case, and many of them do, which is great. But framing up those questions in that sense really help you keep aligned.
Yeah, there was a show that I did earlier with a somebody called Bob Rodwell, who was a specialist in the marketing procurement space, and he advocated, this was particular to marketing, but I think that it's relevant to a lot of services, especially where stakeholders are a little bit skeptical of procurement, is that the RFP process should essentially be you are down to 2 or 3 suppliers that you are very interested in, and you want to know more about those 2 or 3 suppliers. It shouldn't be send it out to 20 different firms or even 10 different firms and then run a 3 to 4 month process to try and analyze all the data points that you've got back from these 10 or 20 firms. That it would be far easier if you kind of do all that up front, then send it out to 2 or 3, and it makes the process a lot more streamlined and a lot more kind of, the information you get from it is a lot more actionable. And I wondered if that's what you see among your client base, or whether it's 50-50, or that if firms really aren't there yet.
Yeah, the advent of the profiles have really helped us reduce the number of vendors involved. We still have clients who come in, especially, we have a lot of public sector clients that have to publish the RFP in a public setting on a website, and they get a lot of interest, and they'll get 20 people, 20 organizations that are interested and that go through the process. And I understand that that's the requirement that they have to publish. But even then, there is something to be said for going in gates where you could essentially start to whittle away, these big. If I think there's got to be a dollar amount within a procurement organization to say, if it's over a certain dollar amount, let's do an RFI first, get some broad interest, let people know the timing, so that they may be a great fit, but maybe they don't have the capacity at the time. Let us the RFPs in which the buyer can tell as much information as they can to the vendor community. Those are some of the best ones, right, where they're really that shows that partnership is really going to be there.
Yeah, communication is key, and that's I keep referring to other conversations I've had, but I spoke with somebody called Thibaut Chanteau, who was who is a sales professional and a sales coach, and his biggest beef with the RFP process with procurement was communication. That it's kind of everything's written out, you push it out to the to prospects, and then you don't follow up with communication. Everything is hidden behind kind of just this text-based document. And that just really doesn't facilitate a conversation. I think that ties really into, what you say there in terms of some of the challenges of you're not allowing the other side to really participate over and above answering some prescribed questions.
You bet. We have some functionality that is a little bit too early for the market right now that we have not put out there. We've tested it. It's been a little bit scary to some folks out there. And because we track everything to the user, to the click, this hopefully will become more mainstream in a few years. But if you issued me an RFP and I had a team of 5 people responding to it, I hit the submit button, it goes back to you, your team is evaluating these responses. We actually have the capacity now to, I as the vendor can get a report that has my scores anonymized against the other participants, and I can see where I scored well and where I was weak. And within that, I can see which writer on my team wrote the answer, how much time they spent on it. And our goal is to be able to learn from every iteration. So a sales and marketing team who is responding to 5 RFPs a month, they do not want to just get a go or no-go decision. They want to get, was our approach right? Was the pricing right? And so far, we haven't found an organization that's really geared towards giving back as much information right now. And frankly, it scares me a little bit, because what it does tell me is that there's still a lot of subjectivity in the evaluation, where people think, well, I kind of like this one vendor versus another, and I'm prepping for a conversation like that right now. With a nonprofit I work with, our feedback is a public forum, and so I have to give the feedback back to the executive committee and both participating organizations
Right.
are going to be in the room. And so, boy, I better have my T's crossed and my I's dotted.
Yeah, it makes it more of a data-based conversation rather than a preference and a gut feel, which, and that there is a place for that in the decision-making process. It's difficult to make only data-driven decisions, which is probably why folks are a little bit scared of it, but it makes you a lot more accountable, so there's nowhere to hide. You've really got to be able to justify why you may want to select something where the data suggests that an alternative might be the better choice.
Yeah, and we're going to get better. There are two things we're looking at. One is not showing as detailed of information as we originally planned and what we've built in our test environment. And so bringing it up a level and being able to say broadly, you did well here, you didn't do as well here. But also there is kind of a big data aspect to it. And the more, so we focus really on these vendor communities. So in certain areas, especially with consultants, they're going out to the same vendors multiple times a month for these projects. And the sheer volume of engagement is really great because over time, even behind the scenes, we can start to see what are good and bad responses. And one of the ideas is to bring that into the search results. And so when a vendor clicks on a question to work on it, the search results right now pull up things, and there are about 5 factors involved with what is the most relevant search. But in the future, there'll be a qualitative aspect as well that says, hey, in the past, this response has scored well. Now, we can't tell you exactly where, because that's where we'll be able to take this anonymized data and make it a little bit more broad. But if you've used this in 5 responses, I've got some information. I'm sorry, if I've used this response in 5 different RFPs, I can tell you a little bit more about this, that it's been scored well or it hasn't scored as well.
Now, would that allow somebody to game the system a little bit more in terms of their responses, or is the data not at that level that that allows them or affords them the ability to do that?
I'm not exactly sure how someone might game it. Because there still is the element of, if this was a low scoring answer, but we don't know exactly why. We save every, it's a question and response level. So sometimes those responses are, a number with a comment or a short answer. But we also have lots of text-based answers and formatted text and paragraphs long. And that's the kind of thing that it's kind of nice to see. It would be even better if we could capture the notes and try to anonymize those and say, this vendor gave us really good detail here versus I'm really confused what they're trying to sell us. Right. I mean, that would be really good information. Yeah. So we are actually capture all that data, that detail. We just have to find a way, a fair way that everybody's comfortable with of showing that to the parties.
And do you think that suppliers would use that either to self-select themselves out if they're being able to see that they're really not competitive early on and save everybody a lot of hassle, or to try and optimize their responses?
I don't know if they'd be able to self-select out unless they're seeing that because we can actually, if we wanted to, we could have the system make a first pass at the best possible answer we have in the knowledge base right now. And I guess we could show a possible score and show that, hey, you're not really well suited for this. You just brought that up. I'm actually that's a really interesting thing to pursue. The biggest thing for us was sales and marketing teams told us that if we could give them the detailed information of where they were good and bad in their responding, it would be worth a lot of money for them. They can ask to be able to see where they didn't have good responses, or even holes in capabilities. Yeah. So we answered false to these 15 capability questions. Well, maybe that's something we should put on the roadmap for next year.
Yeah, which ones of those were important? No, it's fascinating. I know you said that it's not something that's ready for prime time yet, but just the development of the capability is really interesting in terms of where we can take what is considered by many to be a paper-based kind of transactional process to something where there's so much data and intelligence that you can pull in ways that you probably never even thought about it before.
Yeah, and there's, of course, the advent of the legal oversight that's saying, okay, this is what our lawyers are saying right now. Well, who owns that data? Who owns the ratings and the evaluation? Is that the buyer in this case, or if we aggregate it and anonymize it, who owns that? And so I will say that we've got a lot of details to work out, but that's all just human stuff that we can get over. But I see in the future the ability for us to really get better at our own responding and have much more analysis into our own processes.
Well, we talked a little earlier about RFP, RFI, kind of what's the best approach, and if an RFP even is the best approach. And then, kind of, I don't want to say sidetrack, because it was a really interesting conversation in terms of what's possible in the future. What I'd like to do is just kind of bring things back and think about that if you've decided that an RFP is the right thing that you're going to pursue for a product or service that you're in the market to buy, what were some of the pitfalls that you have seen, or how can professionals avoid the pitfalls that you see to essentially develop an RFP which enables them to get the most out of their ability and their opportunity to go to market?
Yes, as we kind of alluded to one time, the pitfall of not starting with the value statements internally. I think starting off with setting the goals and the priorities, which will guide the RFP questions. We have templates built in the system. I mean, we help our clients build templates, and there's nothing wrong with a template as long as it is analyzed at the time of use. We see questions that aren't really germane to the discussion sometimes, so it definitely is on the buyer's plate to look at these questions and say, what is the meaning of this? And if I don't understand this question, I need to go back to the stakeholder and figure it out. We assign owners to every section and approvers, and so we try to minimize the number of irrelevant questions that go out, but it still does happen. Painting vendors into a corner, we talked about that. We love open-ended responses, and most procurement people are going to get more information out of an open-ended response, but they have to evaluate it. And that's a tough thing. It's so easy to ask true-false questions or drop downs. Yeah. And we even have some auto scoring built in for those kinds of things, because that's necessary in a lot of cases. Security questionnaires for sure. But when it comes down to, we did an RFP for PR services, and it was all open-ended, and it was so great to see the styles that people were using, the way they write, the ideas they have, because we're trying to buy their ideas. We're trying to buy them on their persuasiveness. And so we wanted to see them in their natural form. Yeah,
it's funny how we force service providers, particularly creative ones, to answer structured boilerplate questions, but it's because we want to be able to evaluate them on an apples to apples basis when they can't be evaluated on an apples to apples basis, because there's a lot more subjectivity into the decision making process than it just being a bunch of numbers.
Well, we did some research too early on with a lot of architecture firms, and my wife being in that space was quite easy, and we saw all these proposals for the same project, and they were all bound in different ways. And just the packaging was enough to really start to influence the evaluation team. And that's the point of it. That was the point that the architects were making to make their projects stand out. And I totally understand that. But when we've seen RFPs come through for some more creative projects through our system, what we like is we do force as much as we can an apples to apples comparison, but in the same vein, in those questions, those free form questions, for these guys to be able to embed videos and pictures and write narratives, it still allows them to color within the lines. And then we can really look at, the evaluators can really look at the meat of that substance and not just what it's packaged in and how nice it looks.
And one of the things that you talked about was, in a blog post that I read, was not being a one and done purchaser. And I was just interested to understand what you meant by that.
Well, that's kind of a philosophy of not really being in it for the relationship. And so if you're just, I know a guy who's a good friend who buys raw materials for manufacturing, and he's only concerned about the quality of the supply. He's not necessarily he doesn't really care about the relationship with the supplier, because contractually he's going to get X amount of goods at X time, and it's going to cost this much. And we live in a society now where it's so easy to just jump online and make this purchase. We buy the cheapest thing, and we have lots of great online things. But think about the difference when you're in a shop, and you're in a shop in your neighborhood, and you have that relationship, and you're not necessarily buying on price now. It's a different scenario. You've got a relationship. And there's if the quality is not right, you can take it back and you can have this conversation. And some places obviously do really well online with that, building that relationship. But knowing that you're going to go into essentially a partnership with this vendor you choose, you've got to treat them well up front.
Right. It's going back to the fact that we're moving to an environment where it's about relationships rather than transactions again, something that we kind of mentioned at the top of the show.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm kind of mindful of the time, and so I think unfortunately we're coming kind of towards the end of the show, but I had a last question, and we talked a lot about the different tactics and strategies that you can use to build more effective RFPs and to get better, more thoughtful answers out of the RFP process. If there's one thing that you could say to a buyer that they should do on the next RFP, really that would have the greatest impact on how effective it would be, what would you recommend to them?
I would say that it's a couple parts, and one is when we start a new RFP with a client, we typically go out there and grab a couple of examples of things we find out there on the internet. And that helps us think of questions we wouldn't have otherwise thought of, in the way they frame the questions. And so that's just to make sure we're not missing something that's really obvious. Right. But one of the things that I love to see in RFPs are questions interspersed in different areas about, is there any information that we have not provided that you need, or is there another solution that we are not thinking of that you could suggest for us in this case? And it really it does create that relationship, and it also gives you that opportunity as a buyer to say, oh, you know what, I was asking for this, but what I really need is what these people are proposing, which is maybe a bigger, broader, and more valuable solution.
Yeah, which makes it more like a proposal than a quote, doesn't it? You're asking for them to actually propose a solution to whatever business challenge that you're having, not for a quote on something that you're already pre-describing what you're asking for.
Exactly. And, we get wrapped up in terminology all the time. We often say, well, an RFP is just an RFI with a dollar amount at the end of it. But You're absolutely right. That, if we were going to get down to all these semantics, request for a quote, just give me the price. Right. And you should make that as quick and easy as possible. But you're right. The proposal aspect is very much meant to be highly qualitative, and that's where, and again, I only want to really judge, between 2 and 5. Right. Responses for that.
Yeah, as an example, I was helping a company respond to an RFP recently. It was very prescriptive, and we didn't believe that the right solution for the company was the one that was being asked for in terms of, a proposal to. And so you ask if there's any leeway in actually, can we recommend what we think would be the right proposal? And the answer is, well, no, these are the questions. Yeah. And so already you're kind of saying, well, I'm not even going to participate in that, even though I think I have a solution at a lower cost than anything you will get back from these questions that you're going to ask. Well, Dave, thank you so much for your time today. I think it's really easy for us as procurement professionals to lose sight of a lot of the advice when you sit down and you start writing an RFP. it sounds like you think of RFP writing and the management of the RFP process as being kind of procurement 101. It's one of the first things that we taught as we enter our first buying or first procurement role. But I think when you start getting into it and digging into the details, it's really anything but that if you really want to maximize the value of the process and to get a result which is probably greater than what the potential was when you set out to write the RFP.
And that's where we come back to the name of your program. It
right.
is just as much of an art as it is a science.
Right.
So.
Well, what would be a good way for listeners to contact you if they're interested in talking a little bit further?
Well, you can always visit our website at rfp365.com.
Okay, well, I will link to your website in the show notes. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/RFP. That's artofprocurement.com/RFP. So, Dave, thank you very much again.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, will do. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.